In the year 612 AD, on a stretch of unforgiving land between mountain fortresses and the winding rivers of the Korean peninsula, an event occurred so staggering that even centuries later it still seems impossible. More than 300,000 men vanished in a single campaign, swallowed not by some legendary monster or a mythical curse, but by strategy, deception, exhaustion, and the brutal realism of war. The Battle of Salsu has been called many things: a miracle, a tragedy, a lesson carved into the bones of empires. But at its core, it is the story of how a vastly outnumbered kingdom used its will, its terrain, and the brilliance of one commander to shatter the mightiest army the world had ever assembled. To understand how such devastation came to pass, we must begin with the powerful and ambitious Sui dynasty of China, a young empire that had risen from centuries of division. After nearly 300 years of chaos and fragmentation, the Chinese heartland had finally been reunited under the Sui, and the emperor who inherited this restored realm, Emperor Yang, saw himself as more than a ruler. He saw himself as the central pillar in the ancient Tianxia order, the one destined to bring all lands under heaven into harmony beneath his authority. In that worldview, independence from China was not merely political resistance. It was a threat to the cosmic order. And no neighbor embodied that defiance more sharply than the kingdom of Goguryeo. Goguryeo stood like a fortress between empires, controlling the rugged mountains and river valleys of northern Korea and parts of Manchuria. Its kings treated foreign rulers as equals, refusing to kneel and refusing to acknowledge China as their superior. More than that, they had the military strength to back up such defiance. Their armies were hardy, disciplined, and accustomed to fighting in terrain that punished outsiders. Their mountain fortresses formed a defensive web designed not to win quick victories, but to grind down invaders by dragging campaigns into months of starvation and disease. And their elite heavy cavalry, the Gamusa, ironclad riders atop armored horses, could tear through weakened infantry like a hammer breaking brittle stone. When Emperor Wen of Sui, Yang's father, launched the first great campaign against Goguryeo in 598, he felt the crushing weight of that terrain and that army. Rain flooded the roads, sickness spread through the camps, and the impenetrable fortress lines held firm. The mighty Sui expedition limped home defeated. For most rulers, such a humiliation might have been a warning, but for Emperor Yang, it became an obsession. Yang vowed that the disaster of 598 would never be repeated. He would not simply build a larger army. He would build the largest force the world had ever seen. To support the impossible scale of his ambitions, he ordered the construction of the Grand Canal, a colossal artery linking the north and south of China, so that troops, food, and equipment could flow like blood through the veins of a revived empire. Upon its completion, he unleashed a mobilization so vast that historians today still struggle to grasp its enormity. The Book of Sui records that more than 133,000 combat troops were summoned, accompanied by nearly 2 million laborers, porters, boatmen, and support staff. Even if the figures are exaggerated, as some scholars suggest, there is no doubt that this was the single greatest pre-gunpowder mobilization in human history. The army was so large that it took 40 days for the entire column to finish departing. The line of marching men stretched for 300 kilometers, a human serpent coiling across the land from horizon to horizon. Anyone watching from a hillside would have seen wave after wave of soldiers, day after day, a spectacle both magnificent and terrifying. This was more than a military expedition. It was a message. The Sui Empire wanted the world to know that the age of division was over, and the age of overwhelming imperial power had begun. But numbers alone do not win battles, and great armies can crumble under the weight of their own size. From the very beginning, cracks appeared in Emperor Yang's strategy, cracks that would widen until they became chasms. For one, Yang ruled through extreme centralization. He did not trust his generals. Victory, in his eyes, was meaningful only if it carried his signature. Because of this, he issued secret orders forbidding any major maneuver or decisive action without his personal approval. Even when the defenders of Yodong Fortress, a key Goguryeo stronghold, seemed ready to surrender, the Sui commander was forced to halt everything and send a messenger back to Chang'an, waiting weeks for imperial clearance. Those delays cost lives, initiative, momentum. By summer, the massive Sui host had failed to capture even a single border fortress. Yet as the main army stalled, another force moved deeper into Goguryeo territory, a vanguard of 305,000 elite troops led by the commanders Yu Zhongwen and Yu Wenshu. Their mission was simple in theory: avoid the fortress line, slip past, and strike directly at Pyongyang. If they reached the capital quickly, the war would end before Goguryeo could muster its full strength. But this plan rested on two fragile foundations: the endurance of the marching troops and the reliable delivery of supplies by a naval fleet sailing down the coast. Both assumptions would soon prove catastrophically wrong. The march toward Pyongyang was brutal. The rugged hills and thick forests drained strength from the soldiers. They carried heavy equipment, siege tools, rations, and weapons, far more weight than any man could sustain over such distances. Horses faltered, collapsing in the mud. Men threw away tools, then armor, then even food in desperate attempts to move faster. Each mile traveled made them weaker. Each step carried them farther from home and closer to a land that seemed determined to break them. The naval fleet that was supposed to meet them on the Taidong River never arrived. It had been ambushed by Goguryeo forces, its ships burned or captured, its supply lines severed. The vanguard was now marching blind into enemy territory with empty stores and dwindling hope. Still, Emperor Yang expected victory. Retreat was unthinkable, and so the commanders pressed on, driving their starving, exhausted army toward Pyongyang in one last attempt to seize a decisive victory. By the time the Sui vanguard neared the capital, they were shadows of soldiers. Their ribs showed beneath their armor. Their steps were unsteady. Their spirits were nearly broken, and it was at this moment, when the invaders teetered between desperation and collapse, that the Goguryeo general Ulji Mundok stepped forward. He did not unleash his cavalry immediately. He did not stand in their path with a grand army. Instead, he fought small skirmishes, 7 times in total, losing each one deliberately, drawing the Sui deeper and deeper, letting hunger and exhaustion do his work for him. With every retreat he made, the vanguard advanced further, believing victory was within reach. They did not know they were being led into a trap as old as war itself. When at last they reached the outskirts of Pyongyang, they found a city ready, fortified, and waiting. The walls were deep, the garrisons were fresh, and the defenders were far from broken. In that moment, the Sui commanders understood the truth. They could not take the city. They had no food, no support, no time. Emperor Yang was hundreds of miles away, demanding victory without giving them the means to secure it. Ulji Mundok then sent Yu Zhongwen a poem, silken words praising the general's wisdom, the brilliance of his strategy, the divine reach of his military mind. It flattered so deeply that it almost mocked him. And then came the final twist, an offer to surrender, but only if the Sui withdrew immediately. For the desperate commanders, it was the miracle they needed. They could not conquer Pyongyang, but they could bring home a diplomatic victory. They accepted the offer at once and ordered a retreat. They did not know the surrender was bait, and their retreat was exactly what Ulji Mundok had been waiting for. As the starving army turned back toward the Salsu River, they carried with them a fragile hope of escape. They did not yet realize that the most devastating moment of the entire campaign still lay ahead. The order to withdraw from Pyongyang spread through the starving ranks like a fragile breath of relief. For the first time in weeks, the soldiers felt they might survive. The city that loomed ahead like an immovable mountain was now behind them, and the road home, though long and dangerous, seemed possible. They began the march back toward the Salsu River, unaware that their journey had only just entered its deadliest stage. What awaited them was not safety, but the culmination of a carefully woven trap. The vanguard attempted to organize into a defensive square, the sturdy fang formation designed to protect against ambush from all sides. Under ordinary circumstances, this might have held, but nothing about this army was ordinary anymore. These were not fresh troops. They were hollow-eyed men whose bodies had been drained by weeks of hunger, heat, disease, and constant marching. Maintaining formation required discipline, strength, and clarity. The Sui soldiers possessed none of these. As they trudged back across the rugged terrain, the square dissolved into a disorganized mass. Yet the Salsu River lay ahead of them like a narrow throat in the landscape, the unavoidable passage between destruction and salvation. To enter Goguryeo, they had crossed it. To escape, they would have to cross it again. The river was not particularly wide, nor was it mystical in any way, but its positioning transformed it into a perfect bottleneck. Only a single path allowed crossing. Any army, even a small one, could be slaughtered if caught midstream. A massive army of hundreds of thousands was infinitely more vulnerable. Ulji Mundok understood this better than anyone. He had shaped the battlefield long before the Sue realized there was a battlefield at all. The 7 staged retreats, the skirmishes he allowed himself to lose, the offer of surrender, it all served a single purpose. Not merely to weaken the Sue army, but to make them predictable. He needed them to pull back at exactly the right moment, to funnel themselves toward the river in a state of exhaustion and confusion. Now everything was unfolding precisely as he intended. As the Sui column approached the Salsu, they saw calm water glinting under the sun, the riverbed narrowing between the banks. What they did not see, because they had no strength left for caution, was the invisible division this crossing would impose on their already strained ranks. When an army that size attempted to cross, it could not do so all at once. The front ranks would reach the opposite bank first, the middle ranks would be trapped in the water, and the rear ranks would bottleneck behind them. The cohesion that kept an army alive would disintegrate. Ulji Mundok waited for that exact moment. He did not rely on legends or magical floods. Later storytellers would insist that he built a dam upstream and unleashed a catastrophic wall of water onto the crossing troops. But contemporary records tell no such tale. They record something far more realistic and more impressive. Mundok used the river itself as his blade, turning its natural current, its uneven depth, and the clumsiness of exhausted, armored men into lethal instruments. When roughly half of the Sui army had entered the water, their formation unraveling, their footing clumsy and insecure, the Goguryeo forces struck. They erupted from concealment along the ridges and forests that lined the banks, descending upon the Sui with a precision born from weeks of planning. Arrows rained down on the men in the river, each shot doubling the chaos as armored soldiers struggled to keep their balance. Mounted warriors, especially the heavy Gamusa cavalry, charged the front ranks as they scrambled up the far bank, breaking them before they could regroup. Infantry units targeted the men still waiting on the near side, cutting off their chance to enter the crossing at all. The river turned into a trap from which no order could emerge. Soldiers who tried to flee forward were struck by cavalry. Those who tried to turn back collided with the desperate bodies behind them. Men slipped on the slick stones below the water, dragged down by the weight of their own armor. Panic, once it entered an army, spread faster than any weapon. Formations shattered. Officers lost control. And then, in the middle of the chaos, a devastating blow fell upon the Sui leadership. Right General Xing Xiang, a key commander of the rear units, was cut down. His death severed what little command structure remained. Without him, there was no one left to impose discipline or coordinate any kind of resistance. The Sui army, once a mighty force of 305,000, had become a faceless, leaderless mass of terrified men, crushed between the river behind them and the merciless blows of Goguryeo's soldiers before them. The fighting was no longer battle. It was slaughter. Ulji Mundok ensured that every weakness of the Sui army was exploited to its maximum effect. Their hunger, their exhaustion, their overextended supply lines, their rigid command hierarchy, their blind trust in an enemy's surrender. Each element had been turned into a weapon sharper than any blade. The men who managed to break free from the chaos did not resemble soldiers anymore. They were survivors in the purest sense. Men driven solely by instinct, sprinting, limping, dragging themselves northward, hoping desperately to reach the Yalu River and the borders of their own empire. Some ran without helmets or shields, having thrown them away. Others leaned on broken spears like canes. Many collapsed on the roadside, unable to go any farther. Those who continued did so in silence, chased by the knowledge that their emperor would never forgive failure, but that Goguryeo would never allow escape. To cover the 450 li, nearly 180 kilometers, between Pyongyang and Liaodong in a single desperate day and night was a task beyond human endurance. Yet the remnants of the Sui vanguard attempted it, because the alternative was an unmarked grave in foreign soil. Along the route, Goguryeo's forces harried them relentlessly. There were no large engagements anymore, only ambushes and quick strikes, each one thinning the survivors further. Every hour saw fewer men. Every valley became another place of death. By the time the shattered columns staggered near the Yalu River, only a fraction remained. Of the 305,000 elite soldiers who had marched so confidently toward Pyongyang, only around 2,700 returned to the Sui encampment. Even sources that offer higher estimates do not exceed 7,700. More than 99% of the army had been wiped out. It was not simply defeat, it was annihilation. The magnitude of this destruction echoed instantly through the empire. The mighty Sui, who had once boasted the greatest military force on earth, had lost almost an entire generation of its elite warriors in a single campaign. The soldiers who stumbled back into the main camp were not greeted with triumph, but with silence, disbelief, and dread. The disaster at Salsu had not only broken an army, it had cracked the foundation of an empire. The survivors of the Salsu catastrophe returned not as veterans, but as ghosts wandering back from the edge of oblivion. Their eyes were hollow, their bodies wasted, their minds fractured by the relentless march, the river of death, and the ceaseless pursuit that had turned their retreat into a nightmare. When these broken remnants staggered into the Sui encampment, the commanders and officers who had remained behind could barely comprehend what they were seeing. From the greatest elite force the Empire had ever assembled, only a scattering of men had come home. The camp that had once buzzed with confidence fell into a suffocating silence. The news spread like wildfire. Whispers turned into panic. The realization that nearly an entire vanguard, 305,000 hand-picked soldiers, had vanished shook the military structure to its core. Officers who had been preparing for continuing assaults found their plans meaningless. The army that remained at the border fortresses, stuck for months before the impregnable walls of Goguryeo strongholds, now saw the truth. The entire campaign had failed. Not just failed, but collapsed so completely that it defied logic. There was nothing left to do but withdraw. The great Sui army, which had taken 40 days to march out in all its glory, now limped back with far fewer voices, far fewer banners, and almost no triumph. The path home was long, and though Goguryeo no longer pursued in force, their purpose already fulfilled, the psychological wounds inflicted on the invaders were deeper than any blade could reach. They were marching not toward victory, but toward the ruins of their emperor's dreams. In the capital, Emperor Yang received the news as the shattering blow it truly was. His vision of overwhelming force, his desire to display imperial supremacy, and his obsession with crushing Goguryeo had produced the opposite of what he intended. Tens of thousands of families were left without sons and fathers. Vast regions of the empire were suddenly bereft of able-bodied men. The elite backbone of the Sui military had been severed in a single campaign. The treasury, already strained by the Grand Canal and years of continuous conscription, began to bleed uncontrollably. As the truth of the disaster spread across the empire, a new enemy rose. Not one Goguryeo had deployed, but one born within the Sui heartlands. It came in the form of revolt, disobedience, tax resistance, draft evasion, and widespread civil unrest. Villages refused to send more men. Local leaders defied imperial orders. Farmers abandoned their fields rather than surrender their labor to the never-ending war machine. The people, exhausted by Emperor Yang's relentless ambition, now saw him not as a restorer of unity, but as the architect of their suffering. Salsu had not simply been a military defeat. It had become the spark that ignited the slow, inevitable collapse of the Sui dynasty. Even as the empire reeled, Emperor Yang refused to accept reality. He launched yet another invasion in 613, trying to reclaim the prestige he had lost. But this time, rebellion struck from within his own ranks. Generals turned against him. Troops deserted in droves. The campaign dissolved before it could even reach Goguryeo's borders. In 614, he made one final attempt, but once again the results were the same: failure, resistance, exhaustion. The shadow of Salsu hovered over every soldier, every official, and every province. No one believed in victory anymore. The emperor who had once commanded the largest armies on earth was now feared not by his enemies, but by his own people. Meanwhile, in Goguryeo, the victory at Salsu echoed like a thunderclap. Cities celebrated. Fortresses that had stood firm under Sui siege raised their banners higher. The defenders who had endured hunger and bombardment now understood what their endurance had achieved. They had not merely survived an invasion, they had helped engineer one of the greatest military disasters in ancient history. And at the center of this triumph stood Ulji Mundok, the general who had orchestrated the gradual unraveling of an empire. His name traveled across mountains and seas, praised in poems and remembered in legends, not just as a commander, but as a mastermind of strategic deception. Yet the significance of Salsu extended far beyond the borders of the two warring states. It became a lesson for all future empires seeking to dominate the Korean peninsula. When the Tang dynasty rose from the ashes of the Sui, Emperor Gaozu and his successors approached Goguryeo with caution. They studied the failures of the Sui and recognized a simple truth that had been carved by blood into the land. Numerical superiority was meaningless without logistics, terrain mastery, and adaptable command. Goguryeo had proven that an army could be destroyed not by direct confrontation, but through exhaustion, deception, and the manipulation of geography. Salsu became a case study in asymmetric warfare long before the term existed. Where the Sui relied on rigid hierarchy and overwhelming manpower, Goguryeo used flexibility, intelligence, and intimate knowledge of their homeland. Where the Sui believed in massive formations and continuous resupply, Goguryeo attacked supply lines, stretched the invaders thin, and allowed nature itself to do the killing. And where Emperor Yang clung to personal control, Ulji Mundok used autonomy and anticipation to dictate the rhythm of the conflict. For military thinkers across generations, Salsu demonstrated that the greatest victories are often achieved through patience and understanding, rather than sheer force. From a geopolitical perspective, the battle marked a turning point in the balance of power in Northeast Asia. Goguryeo, though smaller in size and population, proved capable of resisting the might of a superpower. Its fortresses, cavalry, and commanders became symbols of resilience. Even the Tang, far more stable and sophisticated than the Sui, would find Goguryeo a formidable adversary for decades. But for the Sui, the consequences were fatal. The dynasty that had dreamed of rebuilding China into a shining empire lasted only 37 years. 6 years after the disaster at Salsu, Emperor Yang was assassinated by his own men, and with his death, the dynasty crumbled entirely. In historical records, scholars for centuries placed the blame squarely on the emperor's disastrous foreign policy, and most of all, on the catastrophic failure of the Goguryeo campaigns. Salsu was the breaking point. No empire, no matter how vast, could survive the loss of hundreds of thousands of elite troops while facing rampant rebellion at home. The collapse of the Sui was not just the end of a dynasty, but the end of an imperial dream, a dream buried beneath the waters of a quiet river on the Korean peninsula. For Goguryeo, Salsu became a tale of pride, courage, and unwavering resilience. For China, it became a warning written in tragedy. And for historians, it remains one of the clearest examples of how strategy, terrain, and human endurance can reshape the fate of nations. In the end, the Battle of Salsu stands not only as the destruction of 305,000 men in a single campaign, but as the moment when a smaller kingdom taught a rising superpower that strength alone does not guarantee victory. It is a reminder that even the greatest armies can be broken, that arrogance can blind leaders to their own vulnerabilities, and that one brilliant commander, wielding patience and insight, can change the course of history